I'm Geneviève Zubrzitsky. I'm so excited that I'm losing my capacities here. Geneviève Zubrzitsky. I'm director of the Weiser Center for Europe and Eurasia. I'm the Weiser Professor in European and Eurasian Studies and the William H. Sewell Jr. Professor of Sociology. And I'm very pleased to welcome you this afternoon for this very important lecture meeting with Ambassador William B. Taylor. The Weiser Center for Europe and Eurasia is dedicated to the advancement and dissemination of knowledge about and public engagement with the institutions, cultures, and histories of Europe and Eurasia. We provide resources for our students and faculty. We support research. We support teaching in European and Eurasian affairs, but we also deeply believe in engaging the broader public in whatever is going on in the region. We have an outreach mission that we take very seriously. And today we have someone who's extremely knowledgeable about Ukraine, Eastern Europe, and the US, who's coming to talk to us about the current conflict in Ukraine and whether, and that's the title of his lecture, whether we are at an impasse or a turning point. So we're very glad to be able to present this programming to you. And we're grateful also to be co-sponsoring this with the Ford School of Public Policy. I would also like to thank the Southeast Michigan World Affairs Council for making this possible. So Ambassador William B. Taylor is currently Vice President of the Europe and Russia section at the U.S. Institute of Peace. In 2019, he served as chargé d'affaires at the U.S. Embassy in Kyiv and as the U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine from 2006 to 2009. So he has deep knowledge of the region. He's just coming back from 8 days in Kyiv. I think you were in Georgia not long ago also. So he knows really what is brewing over there. So we might have like the most up-to-date information about the conflict. But he's also very knowledgeable about other areas of the world and other conflicts or events. So during the Arab Spring, he oversaw the U.S. assistance and support to Egypt, Tunisia, Libya, and Syria. And in the 1990s, Ambassador Taylor coordinated U.S. assistance to the former Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. Before that, he served on the staff of Senator Bill Bradley, and he's a graduate of West Point and Harvard's Kennedy School and served in the U.S. military. Thank you for your service in all of these capacities. So I want you to join me, please, in offering a very warm welcome to Ambassador Bill Taylor.
Thank you. That's very kind introduction. I am delighted to be here. And if Dave is, I've turned this on, so this is all working now, right? We're good? You can hear in the back? Okay, all right, very good. I am delighted to be here. This is a great opportunity. On the way over here, we were talking about we were talking about people who would be here to have this conversation. And it's great to have people who care about this issue. I will convince you. I hope you'll be convinced that I care about this issue, and I want to be sure that I give my best shot to you to tell you as much as I know about Ukraine, why it's important, why I think it's important for the United States, and so it's great for me to be here. Thank you very much for having me. I did just get back from Kyiv. I've been to Ukraine 8 times since the big war started, since 2022, February 2022. I was there for about 8 days and started off before that in Tbilisi, another conference. But I also work in Washington, so I thought I could give you kind of updates from both capitals, from Kyiv and from Washington. And from Kyiv, the military situation, which I will go into a little bit just to have everybody. Oh, and this is great in here. So the current situation as of a couple of days ago is as you see it here. This map hasn't changed very much over time. There's a couple of little things that I will talk about on how it's gone, but the morale of the Ukrainians, and we've got a lot of Ukrainians in the room right now, so that's another reason I really look forward to having this conversation, but the morale of Ukrainians in Ukraine in particular, but as well as here, I'm sure, varies a lot with what's going on the battlefield. One of the visits that I was there was in the fall of 2022, and everybody will remember that the Russians had come down from Belarus and other places as well, but trying to take Kyiv, and the Ukrainians pushed them back out. And they took back Kharkiv and Kherson, and at that time, the mood, the morale, the enthusiasm of the Ukrainians was just unbounded. Well, you remember this. The Ukrainians in the room will remember exactly that. And it then varied. I was back a couple of other times. One of the later times was actually last March. And last March was at a kind of a low point. The reason for that was, in particular, the Americans, but others. You will remember, we were trying to get this big assistance package, this package of funds through the Congress in order to provide weapons, to continue the flow of weapons to the Ukrainians so they could hold off the Russians. And Congress delayed for like 7 months, and during that 7 months, it was really hard on the front lines. Lost a lot of soldiers. They were pushed back. The mood was not great when I was there. So this last time, I will say that it was better. It was better. So the Ukrainians, as we all know, have taken the initiative. They have used the weapons that we've provided, the Europeans have provided, NATO has provided, and they've pushed into, I wonder if this has no, it's pushed, does this have yeah, it does. There we are, look at this. So they've pushed, the Ukrainians have pushed in, I'm going to show you the detail of this, but just to give you the overview, have pushed into Russia. They've taken the initiative, have pushed into Russia, and the Russians are not real sure how to respond. They're starting to respond here. We'll talk about that in a minute. And that's given some real boost to the Ukrainian morale. However, down here, this hasn't changed very much. The battles around here, and I'll show this in more detail in a minute. It's been a grind. And that line hasn't changed much at all over the last year and a half. So, so we'll go into a little more detail here. All right, so this is where the Ukrainians have pushed into Russia. Okay, so let's see if we can orient here. Here's Ukraine. Here's the salient that the Russians. This is Kursk Oblast. Actual city of Kursk is up here. There's a nuclear power plant as well that is not in danger. That the Ukrainians are not after. But this blue part is where the Ukrainians hold territory, and this is. We'll talk about why that was, why the Ukrainians decided to undertake that operation into Russia, which, as I say, was a big surprise for President Putin. But the Ukrainians are holding territory inside Russia. By the way, Ukrainians can use all the weapons they have, their own as well as the NATO weapons, including our weapons, in this area. Just barely across the line. So that part, this is going to be important in a minute on the question that President Zelensky is asking for in Washington. I'll get to that part. But we've given the Ukrainians the okay to use these weapons along the border, and they're doing exactly that. So this is the part where the Ukrainians have really taken the initiative. However, down here, this is the now famous, people have heard of Pokrovsk. And I'll show you where this is on the. So Pokrovsk is essentially, is here, and the Russians the Russians are pushing, grinding slowly toward Pokrovsk, which is not shown on this map. That's why it's shown on this map. And they've been trying to take this town for months. The way they're doing that, the way the Russians are doing that, is the way they've done to several other towns, again, that people in this room will recognize, Avdiivka, where the Russians will just send wave after wave of Russian soldiers into fortified, defended territory, defended fortifications, and it's terrible what happens to these Russian soldiers. They lose as much as like 1,000 a day, 30,000 a month. This is, but they keep coming, and around Pokrovsk, I mentioned that there was a relationship between this part of the front here. So Pokrovsk down here, the incursion into Kursk is right here, and President Zelensky and General Syrsky, the new commander, were hoping that the Russians, when their territory was invaded and held, they were hoping that some of the Russian forces down here in Donetsk would be pulled back up to try to defend against this attack into Russia. It didn't really happen. It didn't really happen. That is, Putin has found it to be okay that the Ukrainians occupy part of his territory. This is the first time Russia has been invaded since 1942. So you can understand why President Zelensky and Syrsky and the generals thought that the Russians would take it a little more seriously and make a bigger effort and try to pull forces from one part of the front line up to defend themselves there. But they haven't. So the basic story on the military front, and I'll get the political front next, is that there's not much change over the time. Again, the Russians have taken a little bit of territory, the Ukrainians have taken a little bit of territory inside Russia, but it's not moved that much. And we're going to talk about why that matters and what the implications of that are. So I will leave just this other one here just to have that for a while. But let's talk now about the political side of this. So I was in Kyiv a week and a half ago. I was in Washington this morning. And there, President Zelensky, having come down from New York, I'm sure you've read, he had two good speeches where he spoke to the Security Council in New York and the General Assembly, UN General Assembly, yesterday. Good talks. He was making the case, President Zelensky was making the case that the United States and the world, the UN, needs to keep our collective eyes on this issue, on this war, on this aggression, on this violation of all of the principles that the UN stands for, that the UN is based on. And we're talking here just basic principles of the sovereignty of nations. All nations are sovereign, including Ukraine, and its borders, like all nations' borders, should be respected, and that's what has been violated right now. And so President Zelensky wants to make the case on that big stage at the UN, both the Security Council and then the General Assembly, that it's important for the international community keep its eye, keep focus, put pressure on the Russians. That is his message. If he is convinced that if there's enough pressure in a couple of different ways put on the Russians, that the Russians will come to the conclusion that they're not going to win this war. When President Putin realizes, this is what President Zelensky would like to make the case, when President Putin realizes that the Ukrainians are not going to stop fighting. The Ukrainians, as they say, they have no place to go. They're fighting for their land. They're fighting for their nation. They're fighting for their culture, their history, their language, their heroes. So they are not going anywhere. They're continuing to fight. We're going to come back to that too. It's also important for Putin to realize that the Europeans and the Americans are going to continue to support. And in this regard, I'll take the opportunity to point out that the U.S. position has evolved a little bit over the last month. When we talk about how long the United States is going to support the Ukrainians, which is important if we're going to get Putin to recognize that he can't win this war, what you've heard President Biden say and others have said, we'll be with Ukraine for as long as it takes. Good as far as it goes. It doesn't say really what the goal is. In the last month, that goal has become clear. They've changed the rhetoric, they've changed the goal, they've changed what they're saying they're after. And President Biden has said now several times, he's changed it. It's no longer does he say, we'll be with Ukrainians as long as it takes. He now says, we'll be with Ukrainians until they win, until they prevail. He put out a statement just yesterday. Again, this is the update from Washington. He put out a statement just from yesterday with exactly that. He said, we're going to be there until Ukrainians win. He announced a big new package of assistance, mostly military assistance, like $5 billion more coming in order to use all the funds that are available, that the Congress has made available. And he put out the statement and he said that again, that our goal, the U.S. goal, is to support the Ukrainians until they win. And that's an important piece. So President Zelensky is first in New York, and then today in Washington, making that case, making the case that if we continue to support them until they win, and we're going to come back and talk about what win means, but if we do that, then President Zelensky is making the case that they can win, that they can prevail. And he's got what he's calling a victory plan. And President Zelensky has, when we were there a week and a half ago, 2 weeks ago now, at a big conference, was part of the reason I was there. He spoke to the conference, and people were interested in this victory plan. So President Zelensky, what do you have in mind here? What is this plan? He could say a little bit about it, but he said, I'm not going to tell anyone until I talk to President Biden. He could have been very clear that he was not going to describe in any detail what he had in mind. We have a general sense, and he has laid it out today. I don't have the details of it yet. Maybe somebody in this room does, and we can talk about that. I'd love to hear. But the general notion is what I mentioned earlier, and that is put pressure on President Putin in a lot of different ways so that he concludes that he can't win and he has to find a way out. President Putin has to find a way to stop this war. And he can have this conversation with President Zelensky and if he recognizes that that this bad mistake that he made 2.5 years ago is one that he can somehow get out of, that's the goal. That's what this victory plan is for. What's in the victory plan? One is military. And President Zelensky is asking for some specific things from the United States and others. But in particular, what President Zelensky would like to be able to do is use U.S. weapons to fire into Russia, deep into Russia. And the reason you would think that they'd be able to do that, but actually no. The U.S. policy is that we don't allow the Ukrainians to use the long-range missiles that we have given the Ukrainians, but we don't let them use the long-range missiles other than inside occupied territory, in Crimea. They've used them in Crimea, but we don't let them go deep into Russia. Somebody's going to say, hey, but hold it. I have read, and we've all seen, that the Ukrainians are actually firing deep into Russia. Moscow's not on this map, but if Moscow's kind of way up here, there's to the northwest of Moscow, up here is Tver. And so the Russian scholars in the room will know where Tver is. It's a long way from Ukraine. And the Ukrainians, about a week ago, blew up this enormous ammunition dump in Tver. And people said, that's hundreds of miles using their own weapons. What President Zelensky is asking President Biden for today in Washington is for permission to use the U.S. weapons deep into Russia against military targets. He's not talking about doing what the Russians are doing, which goes against population, goes against civilian targets, goes against hospitals. No, the Ukrainians have been very careful to go against military targets. And these military targets are air bases from which jets take off and fire into Ukraine. And these military targets are missile launch sites where they fire into Ukraine. They are artillery shots. So these are military targets that you would think we would be willing to have the Ukrainians have the authority to shoot at. And my own bet, my bet is that President Zelensky is going to succeed in that. He's going to convince President Biden that this is a good idea. That within the next, something. People in this room will know that the United States has been, let's say, deliberate, but others would say slow, in providing weapons to the Ukrainians that get more and more sophisticated, more and more powerful. For a long time, and you can see how the politics that I'm now talking about also involves the military, which I started out with. But for a long time, one by one, the Americans agreed to give the Ukrainians certain weapons. First, it was these shoulder-fired javelin weapons, and then it was these HIMARS artillery systems. And then it was Abrams tanks, our top-of-the-line tanks. And then it was F-16s. And finally it was ATACMS, these long-range Army missiles. And each time there was a debate in Washington among the State Department and the Defense Department and the National Security Council. And there were people that were saying, yes, the Ukrainians need this next weapon, the F-16s. We haven't given permission yet. But others within the government were saying, oh yeah, but what are the Russians going to do if we provide them with this new system? And we have that debate for a while. And then finally, in every case, for all those ones I mentioned, the administration came to the right answer. That is, they gave the approval to provide the HIMARS, the tanks, the F-16s, the ATACMS, and the latest one was the ability to use those weapons close to the border. So the next question is, are they going to get the approval that President Zelensky is asking President Biden for to use those weapons deep into Russia at military targets? That's one of the big things that's is on the table, that is being discussed today. And as I say, I think that will probably be resolved. I think that will probably come to a positive conclusion. That is, the Americans will say, yes, you can use these. It's also complicated because the American approval also triggers the French and the Brits. The Germans do have, have these long-range weapons, but they are not ready to provide them to the Ukrainians. But the Brits and the French have. But there are some U.S. components in these French and British systems that means that we have a say as to whether or not they can use them deep into Russia. My bet is this decision will come soon and allow all three of these nations, us, the French, and the Brits, to use these deep. That will help. It's not going to change the nature of the war, but it's going to help. The Russians, as we know, are much bigger than the Ukrainians. They have 140 million Russians, and the Ukrainians, you tell me, it's 30 million or so Ukrainians. The size of the economies, the size of the defense industrial bases. The Russians are clearly much larger and much more capable. They can probably last longer. So this is going to have this lasting longer, as I've already mentioned, is if the international community, the Americans and the Europeans can put pressure on Putin one way or the other to look for a way to get out of the problem he's caused for himself. That's the goal of this victory plan. Okay, so I've talked about the military situation, and I've talked about the political situation. Let me just do the last bit of what I would like to do, and then I'm really eager to have this conversation. I see we have mics, and people can either come to the mic or it will come to you. Why I think we care about this. Now, maybe I'm preaching to the choir here, but I have an opportunity to talk to a lot of people around the country. And I've been in big cities and small, and in the World Affairs Council that Lynn is now sponsoring me here with you all, has World Affairs Councils in a lot of towns and cities around the country, and I've spoken to. And there are people who say, maybe in this room too, why does it matter to us? Why are we putting so much effort? Why do we care what happens in Ukraine? People in this room probably have gotten that question, and I'd love to get your thoughts on this. My answer is multifold. It's several-fold. That is, it has several components. The reason that in Iowa I'm going to be in Wyoming next week, that appeals to people in kind of Midwest or wherever, is that it's a matter of our security. It's U.S. security that we're talking about here. How is that? Why is that, they will say. It is because Russia is moving across, is trying to take over Ukraine. And Ukraine borders on NATO. We are in NATO. Our soldiers are in Poland and in Romania and in Slovakia and in Bulgaria. Our soldiers are there. The Ukrainians are trying to keep the Russians, who are now here, from coming and taking over the country, taking over Ukraine. If they do, if the Russians do, then the likelihood, the possibility, even the probability of conflict with American soldiers goes up. Right now, there are no soldiers, no U.S. soldiers. The Ukrainians are stopping the Russians for 2.5 years. I keep track of how many days it is. It's 945 days, I think, is today. 945 days, the Ukrainians have been stopping the Russians from getting to the NATO border. And that matters to us. That matters to U.S. soldiers. That matters to U.S. I was in the military, as Genevieve said. Our soldiers will be in that fight if the Russians continue after Ukraine. It's a security issue. We also care about the security of Europe, not just the United States and our soldiers, but it's also Europe, for all the reasons that I don't have to talk to this crowd about. That's the security argument, which appeals to some people, resonates with some people. There's another argument that is persuasive to kind of international relations students. Maybe there are some in this room. But this notion of order, this notion of what kind of a world do we want to live in, and our kids, and I've got a grandson right over here. What kind of world do we want them to live in? One that, an order that kind of keeps big nations from invading little nations? That's an order. That's an order that we helped establish after World War II. And that's an order that the Russians have destroyed, or trying to destroy, by invading Ukraine. The Russians are violating the principles of that order. The principles of that order are the ones we talked about earlier at the UN. We're talking about sovereignty and territorial integrity. I mean, that's what the Ukrainians are also fighting for. They're fighting for that order, so that might doesn't make right, so that big nations don't invade smaller nations, neighboring nations, and take territory. So there's an order argument. The other one that again is, I find compelling, is a moral argument. And the moral argument is, this is wrong. When you invade your neighbor and you kill civilians and the things that the Russians have done in Ukraine, horrible, despicable, atrocities, war crimes, assassinations, torture, rape. They've taken children. They've kidnapped Ukrainian children, take them back into Russia. This is wrong. This is morally offensive. They bomb hospitals. There is that argument, and the related argument, the follow-on to that moral argument is someone needs to be held accountable. Goes back to the middle argument about order. If you want to have an order, you've got to be sure that if the people who violate that order pay the price. There has to be some accountability. And the only way there's going to be accountability, and those people who have committed those crimes are going to be brought to justice, is if Ukraine wins. It goes back to what President Biden and what the administration and what the United States now stands for, and that is Ukraine needs to win this war. Last thing I'll say on this is, I said I would come back to what does win mean? You know, what does it mean to win this war? When I was in Ukraine a week and a half ago, talked to a whole lot of people in and out of the military, old and young, some people that used to be in the government no longer, some people still in the government, and there are those people who are the people who feel the strongest are those that say, we have to get all the Russians out of our country. We have to get all the Russians out of all of our country. And so they talk about the 1991 borders. 1991, the Ukrainians became independent along with the other former Soviet states. So all of a sudden we had 15 new independent states, including Ukraine, and the borders were clear. And so the borders were as they were in the Soviet times. This was Ukraine, and this was the Russian Soviet Socialist Republic, and Armenia, and Ukraine was recognized in these borders. And so this first group, because they feel so strongly, and because a lot of them, almost every family there has lost soldiers, lost fathers, brothers, sisters, mothers, and the argument here is a powerful one. It's the moral one that I mentioned, and that is those people who were killed or badly wounded should not have died in vain. We owe it to them, they will argue, do argue, to continue to fight until the Russians are out. They recognize that's hard, and they recognize it depends a whole lot on the Americans and the Europeans, but they're absolutely convinced. There are some Ukrainians who will say, yes, that's important. They'll say, yes, their territory is important. But then they go on to the next and they say, we can't fight forever. And we're running out of soldiers, this second group will tell me. They can't say that very publicly because the first group that I mentioned, the first argument, that is, we owe it to the fallen, is so powerful that to suggest in public, out loud, that we might have to compromise on territories is just not possible at this point. But that conversation is going on. And I'd be interested in the Ukrainians in the room in response to that. President Zelensky has a very good feel for where Ukrainian people are. And the Ukrainian people have a very good feel for where President Zelensky is. In my view, they depend on each other. Zelensky depends on Ukrainians, Ukrainians depend on Zelensky, and they are in sync to a large degree. There's some issues after 945 days of fighting. There's some issues having to do with the Zelensky administration, but nonetheless, on this issue, they are very strongly with him. And he will say, President Zelensky will say, 1991 borders. 1991 borders. But he says, part of the way we're going to get back the 1991 borders, get back that territory, is through military means. I mean, we're going to push them as hard as we can. We're going to build up. We need support from the Americans. We need to be able to shoot deep into Russia. We're going to do part of that by military means. But he also says, and this gets less attention, but he also says, we're going to get some of that back, some of the rest of that 1991 borders, through diplomacy, which suggests that, and probably Ukrainians would have a good conversation about this, which suggests that, that it's not going to happen right away. It may take time. And here, he doesn't say this, but others, when other people thinking about this scenario, will remember West Germany and East Germany. West Germany came into NATO, helped form the European Union, developed its economy, all the while the Soviet Union dominated East Germany. And so people remember that. They say, well, you know, they finally, East Germany, West Germany finally got reunited, and that's a model that we also remember. Then the Baltics, our Baltic colleagues, you know, the Estonians, Latvians, Lithuanians, also remember that when the Soviet Union annexed them in World War II, Americans and other nations never recognized that, never recognized the Soviet occupation of annexation of the Baltic states. And took a long time, but the Baltic states got their freedom, joined the European Union, joined NATO. When I mention this to the Ukrainians, they say, we're not waiting that long. You know, that's too long to wait. Nonetheless, there are historical ways that we have figured out some of these problems. I think that the Ukrainians ought to be in NATO, and I think that the only way that, by the way, the people who are having this conversation about maybe we have, you know, territory is important, but the existence of the nation is even more important, and we might have to at least temporarily give up our immediate claim, not even claim, our immediate intent to take back Crimea or Donbass. And the way that President Zelensky talks about, we're going to do some by military means and some by diplomatic means, but they will say that has to come. That has to come. That has to be the end point. That's how this war ends. Okay, so I've tried to do the military side. I've tried to do the political side, what's going on in Washington. I've tried to do a little bit of why we should care. I would love to get people's thoughts on that. And then finally, how this ends, how the Ukrainians are thinking about how this ends. And I would love to have your thoughts about this. How do you? And so I think the way it works, you can either, oh yeah, good. You can either go to the mic, as you were doing, or you can raise your hand and somebody will bring the mic to you.
So yes, you can line up there, and if you're on the other side, or if you're too shy to stand up,
just put your hand up.
please wave, so that someone, Derek is there, and get a.
Sir. Yeah.
Good evening, sir. Good evening, audience. My name is Yuri Kaparulin, and I am a visiting fellow scholars at risk program at the University of Michigan, and also at the Weiser Center for Europe and Eurasia Studies and Raoul Wallenberg Center, University of Michigan. I'm originally from Ukraine, from the city of Kherson, and I came here, as I said, as a scholars at risk fellow at Weiser Center. And mainly I'm historian and I'm docent of Kherson State University, what now is relocated to Western Ukraine. And as historian, I want to ask you the question about the time when you was on serve as a US ambassador in Ukraine. So it was a time of President Yushchenko,
Yes.
I remember 2008. It was a big discussion after Bucharest NATO forum when NATO countries declared that it will be a clear way for Ukraine and Georgia possibly to the NATO.
Yep.
And we remember what happened after. Same year on August, Russia attacked Georgia.
Yep.
And possibly after that, they started preparing the invasion to Ukraine, what
Yep.
happened in 2014. I will ask you, maybe you can tell a bit more about that time and your experience in this way. Is it was like loose chance for both of us, Ukraine, US, and NATO, to invade Ukraine in NATO? And as you said today, today in your presentation, it's important to save some kind of the border between NATO countries and Ukraine in some conditions. So what is perspective for Ukraine in NATO realistically for you in the future? Thank you so much.
I love this question. I'm so glad you asked this question because now I can probably go into more detail than I would otherwise be able to do if I weren't asked. So in 2008, President Yushchenko was the president. Yulia Tymoshenko was the prime minister. And in Washington, now this is part, as a historian you will appreciate this, but it's not this part of the story is not well known, but I will share it with you because you asked. In Washington, and people who have worked in the government, in any government, but know that leading up to an event like a Bucharest summit, like a NATO summit, it was April, I think. Is that when the Bucharest summit? April. So well in advance, U.S. government in its bureaucracy, the State Department I've mentioned earlier about how these decisions are made about what weapons to send. Same kind of thing, getting ready for what would be our position on the question about Georgia and Ukraine applying for a membership action plan, essentially a membership path. And the assumption in late 2007, so 6 months before the summit, the assumption in Washington was that we were not going to support that. We were not going to support the membership action plan for Ukraine or Georgia. And I remember, what the U.S. government does, what our State Department does, is they bring back once a year all the ambassadors from all the European nations, all the countries, back into Washington for a conference called Chiefs of Mission Conference. And so, the ambassador to Great Britain and France and Germany, and then here I was from Ukraine. And the Secretary of State speaks to all this assembled ambassadors, and she gives her, this is Condi Rice, Secretary Rice, and she gives her, remarks. And I put up my hand and said, Madam Secretary, you're starting to prepare for the NATO summit in Bucharest. Are we going to support Ukraine's request? And I didn't see this as much as some friends. Dan Fried actually tells this story better than I. And he says that he was the Assistant Secretary for Europe, and so he was in the room, and he saw me ask this question. He saw her response. She was not happy. Because as I say, in late 2007, early 2008, the general assumption was no. The answer was going to be no. Well, it turned out that when the decision got up to President Bush, he said, is the question whether we're going to support Ukraine and Georgia for a NATO membership, action? Is that the question? Yep. We're supporting it, which was totally different from what Condi Rice and Bob Gates and some of these others said. We're supporting it. And he also pointed to Steve Hadley, who's National Security Advisor, and said, I want you to go talk to the Germans and convince them that we're going to support Ukraine in NATO. Steve Hadley did. He's a good friend of mine. He did. He told me the other day, I talked to him on the phone while I was in Kyiv a week and a half ago. We were talking about exactly this question, is why I'm so glad you asked it. He said he failed. He couldn't get the Germans. And then we know Bucharest. Before President Bush arrives in Bucharest, he comes to Kyiv. And the reason he comes to Kyiv on the way to the summit is he wants to be able to tell his colleagues, the other leaders, NATO leaders, Angela Merkel and all the other leaders. He just came from Kyiv. He talked to the president. He talked to the prime minister. He talked to the military. He talked to the civil society. He talked to the journalists. He talked to students. And President Bush wanted to say, really want to be in NATO. So we should approve that. My point on that little story about how he came to Kyiv is that he really wanted to make the case. We really believed it. And as we know, President Putin actually showed up at that meeting, and President Putin, famously at that summit, leans over to President Bush and says, "You know, George, Ukraine's not really a country," which is an early indication of what Putin really still thinks about Ukraine. He doesn't think it's a nation. He doesn't think it's a people, and that was one of his famous lines. And as we know, neither Georgia nor Ukraine got a membership action plan, but they did get that promise that someday you'll be in NATO. And August of that year, Putin, knowing that NATO had said no. NATO had said no to Georgian membership and Ukrainian membership. And Putin, knowing that NATO would not come to Georgia's defense, invaded. And in 2014, knowing that NATO was not going to come to Ukraine's defense, invaded. First Crimea and then Donbass. So we did miss an opportunity there. Had President Bush convinced Angela Merkel of the merits that he was trying to do, Georgia would not be dismembered. The Ukrainians would not be fighting this horrible war. I believe. We'll never know. But that's one last thing. Again, I'm so glad you asked this question. You asked this about. There's lessons for us today. If we decide, if Americans decide, if the United States government decides that we really want to have Ukraine in NATO, and as I mentioned earlier, the only way there's going to be any kind of a conversation about anything less than 1991 borders, the only way that conversation is going to be had is if 80% of Ukraine that is not occupied is in NATO. And then, eventually, like East Germany, West Germany, or like the Baltics, we'll get back the rest. But at least that 80% would go into the EU and go into NATO. And if we want to do that, then the lessons from 2008 are you need to start early, and you need to make it clear, the Americans, we need to make it very clear that this is our top priority. When the message was in 2007, early 2008, that this was not our priority, the Germans and the French figured it out. They've got good diplomats, and they sent back to their capitals and said, the Americans are not going to be pushing very hard. And so the French and the Germans, they locked in, they dug in, and they were not going to be moved at Bucharest. That's a lesson for us now. If we start early and make it clear that this is our top priority, and we're going to twist arms, and we're going to deny weapons. A lot of allies, a lot of NATO allies want the F-35 aircraft. We got ways to twist arms and to squeeze. If we do that, I think it's possible, as kind of the last part of your question, I think it's possible that could happen. And it's important now if we're going to end this war. If that's the only way that the war can possibly end, then that ought to give us real motivation to try to get Ukraine into NATO. Thanks for that question. Thank you. Sir. Oh, how are we doing here on?
You want me to go?
All right. Okay. Since you were brave enough to stand up, you can do it. That's right.
Thanks so much for your time. I have a question about Ukraine's political leadership, and then I actually have a question about Georgia, if that's okay.
Sure.
So from what at least I've gathered, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, at least as a technicality, Zelensky's constitutional term expired on, I think, May 20th. So how long do you think he'll be able to remain in power?
Great question. The answer is until there are elections. The Ukrainian constitution is clear that you can't have elections while under martial law. Martial law will be imposed, will be extended. The Constitution says if the president declares martial law and the Rada, the parliament, approves, they have to get it renewed. I think it's every 6 months. Is it 3 months? Every 3 months. And they've extended it each time because they're still fighting. So you need martial law. So while martial law is in effect, there can't be elections, and that's perfectly legitimate. That's according to the Constitution that he still is in power. He still has. Now, as soon as the war is over somehow, however it ends, when the fighting stops, it's going to be the pent-up demand for elections is going to make it immediate. They're going to go into election mode. And it's going to be wild. I mean, Ukraine is a real democracy, and they have real debates and they have real elections. And this one is going to be one of the wildest, I believe. There'll be a military party in all likelihood. It's a veterans party and opposition that has been pretty quiet. I mentioned Yulia Tymoshenko, and she's still there. She still leads a party, and they will have. So the answer to your question is, when the war ends, martial law is lifted. They'll have elections, and he'll have to. He knows that, and he also knows history, and he's a little worried when he thinks about Churchill. Churchill got the Brits through the war and then lost his election right away. So it could well happen.
Well, thanks for being so direct. And then about Georgia, kind of more of an open-ended question. I think it was a few months ago now. There was a lot of international controversy about a new law they passed that was like restricting the ability of NGOs or foreign NGOs to operate. Some people I've heard just compare this to US FARA laws. Other people I've heard say this means Georgia is becoming authoritarian.
Yep.
What do you think these laws actually mean?
Closer to the latter. Yeah. So there's an election coming up next month in Georgia. And the Georgian Dream, this is the ruling party. It dominates the parliament right now. And if they win again, and they say if we win a constitutional majority, if they win this, I don't know if it's 2/3, or it's probably 60%. If they get enough seats in parliament, they have said they're going to not only, that law that you mentioned is in effect right now. And it says if you get any of your funding, if you're an NGO or a political party, you get any of your funding from abroad, you have to declare that you're, a foreign spy, foreign agent. Thank you. So it really has an effect. But they would go beyond that, is what they threaten. They say we're going to outlaw opposition parties. And if that happens, then it's clear we're not talking about FARA. We're talking about a dictatorship, and that's what they're worried. Yeah. So the head of President Zelensky's political faction, the Servant of the People Party in Kyiv, is Georgian, David Crimea. He's now Ukrainian, of course, but he came from Georgia, and I had an opportunity when I was there last week and a half ago. I had a good conversation with him about a lot of things that we've talked about here. But also, of course, about Georgia, and he's worried. He's really worried. He said, Georgia may be lost, which is really too bad. We can talk about that later on the thing, but they are worried about that. Thanks for that question. Sir.
So my name is Maxim Sych. I'm a faculty member at the business school here, but I'm originally from Kyiv.
Great.
So first of all, thank you for a fascinating conversation. The moral argument is most compelling to me as well. I'm really hesitant to ask this question because I despise Putin, but nonetheless, I'm going to ask you to take a look at the situation from his perspective.
Okay.
So I agree with you that he made a catastrophic military and political mistake 2.5 years ago by invading Ukraine. he clearly pivoted, hoping to outlast Ukraine and the West. Now, it sounds like for all these victory plans, the underlying premise is that we should convince Putin he cannot win this war. 945 days has not been sufficient for that. Putin's rhetoric about his new nuclear doctrine, he's throwing money at volunteers. He doesn't seem to retreat at all. So the question for you, you mentioned also that, yeah, we can extend the range of some of these weapons, but it's unlikely to change the situation. So the question for you is, what needs to change? What conditions, militarily or politically, for him to experience that pressure so he realizes he cannot win this war?
Yeah.
And secondly, perhaps relatedly, so Sun Tzu, right, wrote about this golden bridge for the opponent to retreat upon to win the war. What could be that golden bridge for Putin? Because he cannot take, obviously, a loss to the Russian people, not even to the people, but to the elites. So what could be that golden bridge for him to actually agree to some sort of a peaceful resolution?
Let me ask this. Let me try to talk about the golden bridge, the second part of your question.
Thank you.
Because the Ukrainians that I talked to last week, who were willing to kind of, just among us, have this conversation about a possible compromise, not out loud, because of all of, politically and emotionally, that's just, it was impossible to have that conversation out loud. But in a small room, the people that would have that conversation would talk about the answer to the question earlier about NATO, and they said, we would hate it, and we wouldn't even say it out loud, but we could contemplate an 80% solution. And then where, and 80%, the 80% of Ukrainians not occupied would join NATO, EU. And then I asked them, your question is, well, what does Putin say about this? How could he ever accept this? And they have given some thought to that. This is the golden bridge question. Two people that I talked to last week said that they had had conversations with some Russians, not Putin, but people around him, an oligarch and a couple of people that are in the Putin government, where they were willing to have this conversation about, under your question about under what conditions would Putin allow Ukraine to go in NATO, or the 80% go into NATO, and could he ever countenance that? Could he ever convince the Russian people that? And they wanted to believe, and they indicated that they had some conversation with Russians that allowed them to believe, it's not crazy to think, that Putin, if he got some portion of this bit in red, and again, Ukrainians would never agree to give up claim to that, but if Putin could say, look, we've gotten this at least now, and we've got this line, and this is Novorossiya, this is the new Russia that I've always talked about, he might be able to tell that story. He can tell stories, he can convince Russians, probably whatever, but he could. That would not be impossible. And another argument that talks about why he would agree is that Ukraine in NATO would be constrained against rearming and trying militarily to take back Donbass and Crimea. That is, Russia might be better off from their own security standpoint if Ukraine were constrained, and in NATO in that regard. Apparently, when West Germany entered NATO, they had to commit not to try to take back East Germany militarily. So the Norwegians, when they came into NATO, they promised, it wasn't even a promise, they promised themselves that there would be no NATO bases on Norwegian territory. Now that changed, that is now not the case. They've changed that in 2021, I think. But for a long time, there were no NATO bases in Norway. So people are thinking about that question. They're thinking about that question. No one can get in Putin's head, in your first part of your question. Certainly not me. So I've got some good friends. Angela Stent, whom we know, is probably one of the best students of Vladimir Putin in the world. And she says the same thing. She and I worked together on some things. We were together 2 nights ago. And she will say, the answer to your question, no one really knows. He has had these red lines, or we've thought that he had these red lines. You know, he said that, you know, if you guys arm Ukrainians with your weapons, with M1 tanks, you know, look out. Don't forget, Putin says, I've got nuclear weapons. Don't forget this. As if, you know, we'd forgotten that he didn't. But then he said that also on F-16s. If you guys give them F-16s, look out, you know, like you've never seen. He said more recently, every time the Americans or others are making decisions about what weapons or what authorities, out comes the story about, don't forget, we got nuclear weapons. And he's done it again with this question about, can we give them the authority to shoot deep into Russia? So, and every one of these so-called red lines has fallen to the point where I think there are no red lines. I think it's a bad construct. You know, we shouldn't even talk about red lines. It's a bad idea. The only thing it's your question is that what's in his head. So that gets, you know, the second part. He could probably convince Russians if he wanted, if he realized, and if the people around him, you know, if his generals said, you know, boss, we can't do this. You know, we're running out of soldiers too. And it doesn't look like the Ukrainians are going to give up, and the Americans are still there, and that I think is what we hope for. Now there are people who say, you know, Putin may not be around forever. He may die. He may have his people around him may come and say, you know, boss, you know, we've got this dacha for you. Outside of Moscow, your family's fine. You know, we got this now. You know, but that is not a policy. You know, that's a hope. So that's not a policy. What we could have as a policy is provide the Ukrainians with what they need, stick with them, make it clear that we're there until they prevail, and that is the message that we have to give to Putin.
First of all, thank you for the very informative talk. My name is Greta Euling. I am a cultural anthropologist. I teach here at University of Michigan in the program on international and comparative studies, and my specialty is Eastern Europe. I was hoping that you mentioned that there's both like a military prong and a diplomatic prong, and I was hoping that you might be able to go into more depth and detail on the diplomatic side, like what does that look like, who facilitates, what are the points, but I think an important component of that is I'm curious what you might be able to share about conversations either at USIP or perhaps state about the populations living in the red area who have had pretty much sole access to Russian news media.
Absolutely.
And so I'm curious, what are your thoughts about regaining their loyalty to Ukraine? And I'm especially interested in this from the perspective of President Zelensky's permanent representative to Crimea and the Crimean platform, who are working on plans to do cognitive deoccupation, like disinformation. And their plans are really extensive, but I'm wondering what the conversations are in Washington on that topic.
Yeah, great. So on the Crimean platform and the work that they're doing on exactly that, they say when Crimea comes back to Ukraine, when Ukraine has 1991 borders and Crimea is there, there are a lot of things that have to happen. You know, as you say, that's been 10 years now. I mean, so the Russians invaded Crimea in 2014, and for those 10 years, and Donbass as well, that message, that propaganda, that blast of information, pro-Russian, anti-Ukrainian, has had an effect on people. And so the Crimean platform, as well as the rest of the occupied territories, are going to have a real challenge that they're focused on. And in Washington, you asked, they're sympathetic. know that the first issue is how do they win the war. They got to win the war first, and then they got to reintegrate the people in Crimea and back. Last week, a week and a half ago now, I was at a ceremony where President Zelensky dedicated a new monument to the Crimean genocide, and moving speeches on that. But the first part of your question, let me just say, try to answer as well. What is the diplomatic side? What is the what does he have in mind on the political component of his victory plan? President Zelensky assembled in June in Switzerland. The Swiss actually took a major role in sponsoring this first peace summit that President Zelensky called. He invited virtually every nation, most nations in the world. He did not invite the Russians. The Russians were not in Switzerland for this peace summit in June. But the peace summit was designed, to answer your question, here's what a just and lasting peace looks like. And they've done a lot of work. And actually, my little office has done some work trying to help flesh this out. But they've got a 10-point peace plan. Things like, what does a just and lasting peace look like? Well, part of it, one of those 10 points is food security. You know, you have to be able to export, Ukraine needs to be able to export through the Black Sea, send out their sunflower oil and grains. Food security, nuclear security. We talked about Zaporizhzhia's plant, and the Russians occupy that. Another of the points is return of prisoners of war and return of children that have been. Accountability is one of the 10 points. Reparations is one of the 10 points. And he gathered so he invited like 150, some 100 nations showed up. 80 of those nations signed this declaration at the end, which was a good political move. 45 heads of state actually showed up. Macron and Schultz and Vice President Harris represented us in the United States. So that has been the basis of trying to demonstrate to the Russians that the international community is coming together on the Ukrainian vision of what a just and lasting peace looks like. And he laid it out again. He listed all those 10 points in his speech to the General Assembly yesterday. So he's serious about that. And, that's his diplomatic component. Thank you. Yes, ma'am. I guess. Who's calling? Yes.
Ambassador Taylor.
I will ask people, there's more and more people, but we have only 15 to 20 minutes. Very brief questions.
And I will try to be brief answers.
Because I want everyone to have the opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Taylor, for coming out to U of M, my alma mater. I co-authored a book with Gerald Schechter at USIP on Russian negotiating behavior.
We are redoing that right now. We're updating that. We should talk afterwards.
Give me a call.
Yeah.
And then I worked with Elizabeth Teague at USIP after
On
working with
environmental
her at
things.
RFERL, and she was working on perspectives for ethnic conflict in the former Soviet Union.
Excellent.
And we dissected every ethnic group.
Good.
But I was also the representative to Ukraine for NATO, and a few other things I mentioned in the email.
Yeah.
For me, it is very difficult to look at these diagrams without reliving the past 33 years. 1991, General Lebed doesn't go home with the Russian forces, but stays in Transnistria. 2008, Georgia gets some uninvited visitors that have yet to go home. 2014, Ukraine freezes in a conflict. Minsk 1, Minsk 2, can't undo anything. Any talks of a peace settlement, no matter how temporary we hope it is, before Ukraine regains its legal territory, its sovereignty, and therefore the respect for the rule of law getting upheld on this planet, it becomes quite worrisome when we talk about giving away any territory, particularly when President Putin is speaking a different language.
Yeah.
He does not hear what we say. He doesn't understand it in the way we mean it, yet we continue to, with our endless Western optimism, we tend to embrace the hope that he might come around and actually uphold the document he signed. So first question, what kind of settlement could we respect with President Putin or his administration? And the second factor, as I know USIP is involved in a great deal of thinking ahead, what about the people in these occupied territories, those that have been removed, those that have been tortured on the spot, filtration camps, bringing in new populace into these areas? How damaged is this territory already in a variety of different ways? And is anyone working on saving the people? That's the end of my
Very
question.
good. And the question about Crimea was addressed
Yes.
part of that as well. So that was and the short answer to your question about what could we possibly agree with Putin on, not much, and he doesn't get a vote on NATO. We talked about how, in my view, if we really decide that is going to be the way to end the war, that's the way to eliminate this kind of gray zone between Russia and the West, Europe, which is unstable, which leads to wars and will continue, the ones you've already mentioned. NATO is the answer, and he doesn't get a veto. He will, if in the second scenario where there is some line that's drawn, again, Ukrainians hate that idea, but if there's some line drawn and this 80% is in NATO and this 20% is not, Putin has a say in that, because if that assumes that there's a ceasefire along that line, and he might just violate that. He might just ignore that. So he gets to say if that actually ends the fighting. But it's only with the end of the fighting can Ukraine actually come into NATO. Thank you. Good question. We should talk about that negotiating book. Yeah. Joe.
Hi, my name is Joseph Swanky. I'm a Weiser Center for Europe and Eurasia Distinguished Fellow and a Knight Wallace Fellow here at the University of Michigan. I have not heard anywhere in the media where the Biden administration has been openly stating that they want to see Ukraine join NATO.
No, they haven't said that yet.
Yes.
Oh, right. You're right.
It's interesting that you say yet. Do you think that they could be convinced of this in a short period of time, or do you think that's even possible of changing minds? One of the things that I've been reading most recently in the last 24 hours is that part of Zelensky's secret peace plan is to try to get Ukraine into NATO.
Yep.
Lickety-split within like months, not years. Is this wishful thinking, or is this
lickety-split, months, not years, I think, is, if we're talking about actually in NATO, where Article 5 of NATO treaty applies to some or all of Ukraine, I think that's hard to do. However, there are steps short of that I think President Zelensky could contemplate.
What are those steps?
If NATO alliance were to say to Ukraine, you are invited to come to Brussels, start the negotiations on all of the ways, all of the mechanisms, all of the things that have to happen for you to be in NATO, start those negotiations, that would be a strong signal. And that, I think, is possible. That, I think, is possible. I think we could get that from all the NATO allies. I think even the Biden administration could do it. Now, we're going to have a change in administration, one way or the other in January. It's not going to be President Biden. It is possible that whoever is in the White House would have a bolder policy toward Ukraine and NATO. One other thing, by the way, another step that you asked about. So in addition to starting those negotiations, invitation to start membership negotiations, a big deal. Also, have the Ukrainian ambassador to NATO, and there is one, and they've had an ambassador to NATO for a long time, sit in every meeting of the North Atlantic Council with all the other 32 ambassadors to NATO. The Ukrainians should be there every time, and in the military committee of NATO as well. So there are those kinds of symbolic things, but also procedural things, also necessary steps that show to the Ukrainians and to the Russians that this is serious. This is not 2008. This is a serious step toward that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Joseph.
Hi, first of all, thank you so much for this talk. I'm a student at Wayne State studying global studies and philosophy. You talked about the moral aspect, and I had a question about that. In your opinion, to what extent is it morally justifiable for other nations to intervene and or remain neutral in this war?
Intervene or not, or remain neutral. Is that so? My sense is that the international community, international actors, states, governments have an obligation on the moral aspect that there's a genocide convention that almost all states have signed on to. And that obligates them to take the moral step of intervening to stop a genocide. You could make a strong case, I think you can make a strong case that what the Russians are doing in Ukraine, just got to look at Bucha and Irpin, Mariupol, and listen to what Putin has said he intends to do. He intends to wipe Ukraine off the map. He doesn't think Ukraine is a real nation, is a real people. I think you can make the case for genocide, and that is a legal obligation to intervene. So I don't think I think it's morally questionable to stay neutral in this. Now, then there's the question about militarily intervening, and that's a different issue. But in terms of your moral argument, I think that's strong.
Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much.
I have a question kind of surrounding the coming to an end of the conflict. So as you've mentioned earlier, whether this be from a geopolitical or national sentimental standpoint, there's kind of a sense that we have to hold some people accountable for what has happened, but simultaneously there's also kind of a want, I guess, for some palatable way for the Russians to de-escalate. So how does that, is there those kind of conversations taking place? Do we expect to give out some get out of jail free cards to bring this to a close?
That is a great question. It's a moral dilemma. It's a political dilemma. At the Institute of Peace, I've got a couple of people who have dealt with that. A guy named David Sheffer, who was the first war crimes ambassador. And he's written on this topic. And he said there is a tension. We want to find a way to end this war. We also want to hold people accountable. And if we say that we are going to put Putin in The Hague and try him for war crimes, and even the biggest crime, of course, that he's committed is the crime of aggression. Legally, that's the mother of all crimes. All the rest follow from that. The war crimes, the atrocities. The crime of aggression. If we tell him, as soon as you sign this peace deal, we're coming for you and put you in The Hague, and makes it hard. And so David Sheffer has tried to think about uncomfortably. This is not a comfortable conversation, as you've indicated. Are you willing to give up a little bit on accountability in order to get some progress towards a peace agreement? Ukrainians will tell you no. The Ukrainians, this is a hard one. I'm glad you should write an article on this.
Thank you.
Thank you.
To adjust this because I'm short, but we've mentioned multiple times during the lecture the impact of the U.S. and the U.S. administration in power on the outcome of this war and U.S. commitment to what's going on and to helping Ukraine. Given the current platforms of both candidates, what do you think the effects of a Trump-Vance or a Harris-Walz administration could be? Do you think we'll see a continuation of the commitment we're seeing under the Biden administration with the Harris-Walz presidency? What would the consequences of a Trump-Vance presidency possibly be, in your expert opinion?
I was hoping to get all the way through this conversation without that question.
I'm sorry.
I do expect it. I get it all the time.
You should want to answer it respectfully.
I hear you, but I work. I will try to answer your question. But I work for an organization. The Institute of Peace is bipartisan, nonpartisan. Our board that guides us is half Republican and half Democrat. So all the instructions that we get, all the guidelines, the policy guidelines, we have to be down the middle. We can't take positions. I can't advocate for one or the other, even if I try to answer your question. I can't advocate for one. That said, with that caveat, you're right about the Harris. If it's Kamala Harris, she's part of this administration. Presumably, she supports this latest big $5.5 billion package that President Biden just announced. Presumably, she supports that line that he has now for the last month. We're there. The United States is there until they win, until the Ukrainians win. So I think it's fair to say that would be at least her policy. Maybe she'll be stronger. Maybe somebody mentioned that I haven't said the administration is ready to go on NATO, Ukraine and NATO, and they're not. They haven't gotten there, and that is a strong position of Joseph Biden, of Joe Biden, of President Biden. He is not there yet on Ukraine and NATO. Maybe she will be. So we don't know. On the other side, again, these are just the facts. You know them as well as I. But the presidential candidate, has said he doesn't much care what happens to Ukraine. He said that. I mean, those are almost his words. I'm not sure he got it exactly right, but he said, it doesn't matter to me what happens in Ukraine. That's the vice president candidate. President Trump is hard to figure. I mean, he has done different kind of things. The last couple of days, it's been more kind of kind of almost hostile to Ukraine, and in particular, President Zelensky. There have been reasons for that. The latest little kerfuffle in Washington. The Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, Republican Speaker of the House, wrote to President Zelensky and said, "You have to fire Oksana Markarova as your ambassador to the United States because she organized this trip to a swing state, to Pennsylvania, without a Republican, as part of the celebration, or part of the visit, and so that was blatant interference by President Zelensky into our political part, and that has kind of wound people up on that side. This is to say that we're pretty sure where this administration and presumably a Harris administration would be on this. It's much less clear. Just to say, the reason I say it's a little bit less clear, and it's not just absolutely hostile, is the last time the Congress had an opportunity to vote on this $61 billion package that had been delayed for like 7 months last April, this same Mike Johnson that I just mentioned went down to Mar-a-Lago to talk to former President Trump to get his okay for Johnson to bring up a bill that had $61 billion in it for Ukraine that they desperately needed and that Johnson was supportive of. Johnson, when he was a congressman, he didn't support Ukraine. He voted against this assistance earlier. But by the time when he became the speaker, he got briefings that he'd never gotten before. And he turned around and he convinced former President Trump not to oppose. And so there's a tacit approach. All to say, I'm not sure where they go. There's some controversial statements coming out of that.
Thank you.
Sorry you had to ask that question. Sir.
Sorry, I'll be brief. Last year I had the opportunity to intern in DC at the European Security Helsinki Commission.
Oh, good.
And it was a huge honor. But Senator Cardin, one of the main themes was his worries of Europe slipping into right-wing populism. You see Macron almost lose to Le Pen, Scholz just skirted by, and you see really worrying trends in Scandinavia, Denmark, Sweden. how do you feel the changing geopolitical situations in Europe affecting Putin's vigor?
It's a great question. It's a great question. I comment that issue from a very narrow perspective, and it is Ukraine. I mean, this is what I'm focused on. And the right-wing populists, some of them are supporting Ukraine. So the Italians, for example, the Italian prime minister, she's great. I mean, on the issue that I care about is on Ukraine. She's got other problems in terms of policy. AfD in Germany, I think they've expressed some hostility towards supporting Ukraine. That's a problem. I'm not sure where Marine Le Pen is. Has she said not supportive? She is close to Putin, taking some money from him as well. No, that's exactly right. It's troubling, and Senator Cardin's right to be worried. That said, the European Union and individual NATO members, European NATO, have been very supportive and have provided incredible amounts of weapons and financing. I mean, the Americans have provided the bulk of the weapons, but the Europeans have stepped up as well. The fact is, the Brits have been more willing to send these kinds of weapons than we, and the Brits said, yeah, you're...
They want to send our weapons.
No, they want to send theirs, and the Storm Shadow, which is the equivalent of our ATACMS, they send them first. Same thing with their jets. Same thing with their tanks. They were providing them to the Ukrainians before we did, and then we kind of followed on. So they've been good, and they've been very generous with financial support for the Ukrainian government, which is crucial, which is really important to keep them going. All to say that you're right to worry. We've got our own problems here, and so it's something that I'm glad he's watching it. I'm glad you were there.
Thank you very much. And before we give a warm round of applause, we have little something for you.
Oh.
I won't ask you to open it.
Okay.
I will preview here.
Right. That's right.
In Ukrainian.
In Ukrainian, I know that. No, this is great. This is good. Excellent.
So you have one inside.
It's Michigan colors and it's Ukrainian colors.
Ukrainian colors in Ukrainian.
Exactly.
And I want to thank everyone for coming tonight, and especially to you and Lynn for bringing you. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Great. Thank you.